The rule of thumb in Formula One is to beat your teammate. A quote from Nico Hülkenberg. In Formula One, the most important driver you have to beat is your teammate. He's the only man in equal machinery. You have no excuses about the car or the team, so it's very easy to make a straight comparison between two drivers. If Formula One suddenly changed the regulations and each team could only have one driver who they had to build the team around for the next 3 seasons, who would they pick? I asked you guys over on the community tab, so let's start with who you voted for as the most obvious pick and work our way down to the closest driver pair on the 2023 grid and see if we can pick out an out-and-out number one for each constructor. Aston Martin are up first, and I thought it might be a little bit closer than this. I'm not going to lie to you. 94% of you voted for Fernando Alonso as being the out-and-out team number one at Aston Martin if they could only keep one driver and build around them for the next 3 seasons. And to be fair, since returning to Formula One, Fernando Alonso has been incredibly quick. He's one of those drivers that just gets the absolute maximum out of every single car that he is in, and he's finally come to a team at the right time. Fernando Alonso, throughout his career, has moved over to teams at various points and always seemed to move over when they're just falling apart. Now he's coming to Aston Martin, just as Aston Martin are really clicking together. I think the only problem is Fernando Alonso isn't going to be around for very much longer, you'd imagine. He's getting very old, Fernando Alonso. As I say that, he's just defying age right now. But still, I think Aston Martin do need a driver for that next generation, to which I don't think Lance Stroll is that. He's been in Formula One for a little while now. He's got over 120 Grand Prix, and too many inconsistencies for me, Lance Stroll. For every podium, there's a silly crash. For every points finish, there's a mistake. And Australia, he threw it in the gravel with 2 laps left to go, just completely on his own. And that could have easily been another one of those Stroll incidents where he went from really solid points finish to out of the points because of a little mistake that he made all by himself. I think this poll shows exactly what Aston Martin need. Another driver in that second seat that can eventually replace Fernando Alonso and can be of that caliber, of that kind of driver that is going to drive you forward as a team and possibly win races, win championships if Aston Martin can keep going the way that they want to. You voted for the McLaren as the next most obvious team to have a clear number one, and it's still early for these two, but Lando Norris has been one of the best drivers on the Formula One grid for the last 2 seasons, I think you could argue. 86% of you voting for Lando Norris as the clear number one at McLaren, and I think that makes sense, right? Lando Norris is clearly the driver to build around, especially after beating Daniel Ricciardo. Now, the car didn't suit Daniel Ricciardo whatsoever, but Daniel Ricciardo was a big name coming into the team and was a huge signing for McLaren at the time. Lots of people were massively positive about Daniel Ricciardo dragging McLaren up to be one of those top 3 teams, and Lando Norris outperformed him every single weekend and was able to get consistency out of that McLaren car where Daniel Ricciardo wasn't. I think Lando Norris has just shown over the last few seasons that he's getting better and better, and he hasn't quite hit his ceiling in Formula One yet either. Alongside that, he's probably the perfect personality for McLaren. Like McLaren, all of these sponsors coming in, and Lando Norris with Quadrant, with his Twitch streaming, like he's the perfect driver to try and entice more of those brands to come along the ride for McLaren, and therefore they just seamlessly match together. Piastri, to be able to cut ties with Alpine, come to McLaren, shows that he has at least some belief in this McLaren team to take steps forward, and Piastri looks like an incredible prospect, right? Winning Formula 2, winning Formula 3, back-to-back-to-back championships. Like, loads of teams wanted Oscar Piastri, and we also need to keep hold of him as well, but he's just not quite on the level of Lando Norris right now. Maybe in 3 seasons' time, we'll be looking at this driver pair and it'll be a lot closer. Next up is Williams, and you voted again for Alex Albon with 86% of the vote. Albon, I think, has shown in his first full season with Williams that he is exactly what they need. He also doesn't have that problem that George Russell had, where you could argue George Russell was exactly what Williams needed at the time, but he was always going to be going out of the door. Alex Albon they can keep hold of for the foreseeable future, and I could see him in Williams for the next 3 seasons. But he does have that experience of being in a big team already. So he has that ability to break down what is going on in a car and help develop it. I think the fact that you've seen progress from the 2022 season to the 2023 season is in part down to Alex Albon and his ability as a test driver for Red Bull. He would have had to explain what was happening in the car in quite a lot of detail to those engineers. And he's probably using some of those skills that he built up with the Williams team to progress this Williams car in the correct direction. I therefore completely agree with you in that that this generation for Williams has to be Alex Albon's generation. They have to hold on to him until 2026 at the very minimum. Like, Sargent is his first year in Formula One. Driver Academy, of course, comes through as that kind of Williams man almost. And I think they will keep hold of Logan Sargent for a very long time as well. I could see this being the driver pair at Williams for the foreseeable future. But I think he has a few moments in him. You know, Logan Sargent this season, only 3 races in, but we've seen a few flashes of some of those rookie errors that hopefully will come away from his driving. You know, we see him lose his head in qualifying. We saw him ploughing into the back of Nick De Vries in Australia. I think Sargent will have his time, but for now, Alex Albon just has to be the driver that you listen to, dedicate your time to, and try and get the best out of if you're Williams. Ferrari slot into this next with 80% of you voting for Charles Leclerc to be the clear number 1 at Ferrari. And I think the 2 seasons this pair have had together have shown why Ferrari want Charles Leclerc to build around. And you guys agree with Ferrari that they should be still building around Charles Leclerc. Remember, they ushered out Sebastian Vettel to bring through Charles Leclerc as like a clear number 1. Leclerc has shown great pace. He's shown that he can win Grand Prix when the car is there, but Ferrari do make a lot of mistakes. And I think we're starting to see Charles Leclerc get a bit frustrated with Ferrari. You know, we saw it last season, but maybe in the end he knew that he wasn't actually going to be able to battle with the Red Bulls. I think coming into this season, he was hoping that he'd be a lot closer to Max Verstappen, and it hasn't quite happened again. He's had a really tough first 3 races of the 2023 season. I feel like Charles Leclerc does have a fumble in him though. I'm thinking France last year, Imola last year, Japan last year. Though you could argue that maybe that's because he's absolutely rinsing that Ferrari car for everything that is worth. He's trying to get that extra 1% out of the Ferrari car every single Grand Prix. We haven't actually seen him in like a comfortable lead at any point in like a dominant Ferrari car and doing what Max Verstappen is doing this season, right? Like turning down the engine and just having a lovely time at the front. Whenever he's won, he's had to do it and battled for it every single time. You could argue, though, that Carlos Sainz did beat Charles Leclerc in 2021. That's just come to my mind. 2022, though, Charles Leclerc did show that, again, he was better than Carlos Sainz, though Carlos Sainz did struggle to adapt to the 2022 regulations to begin with. I feel like this is very close as a driver pairing, but I can completely understand why you see Charles Leclerc as the clear number 1 to build around for Ferrari. Red Bull, honestly, I thought would be way higher up on this list. Max Verstappen only got 79% of your guys' vote. He's a 2-time world champion, soon to be 3-time world champion with Red Bull. Came through their driver academy, like he literally is Mr. Red Bull at this point. He was the person to overcome Mercedes and drag Red Bull back up to the top step of the podium and drag Red Bull back up to the top step of the driver's standings as well. He's breaking records with the team every single season. I really don't understand this one. Sergio Perez could literally tattoo Red Bull across his forehead and he still wouldn't be as accepted into the Red Bull franchise as Max Verstappen is. The only thing that Sergio Perez really has is experience. Honestly, I was expecting this percentage to be something like 90-odd% for Max Verstappen. He is Red Bull at this moment in time. I can't see how you'd think that Red Bull would pick any other driver. Maybe I've got a lot of Mexican fans watching, and if you are Mexican, you're watching, thank you very much, but I'm sorry about Sergio Perez. Please leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff, but Max Verstappen is the clear number 1 here. And from Red Bull to their sister team in AlphaTauri, Yuki Tsunoda got 78% of your guys' vote over the 22% for Nick De Vries coming into this season as the obvious team number 1. To sing Tsunoda's praises first, he stepped up massively in terms of pace this season. Like, since Gasly has left, that 3rd season as well for Yuki Tsunoda, he really does feel like he's finally clicked with AlphaTauri and really is showing like why Red Bull have been so enthusiastic about Yuki Tsunoda. We've got to remember that he was fast-tracked into Formula 1. Like, he had 1 season in Formula 3, 1 season in Formula 2, was leveled up through the standings straight away by Red Bull. They got him into the AlphaTauri basically as quickly as they possibly could, and I think we're finally seeing why they did that. I think it took him a little while to settle in, whereas Nick De Vries is a strange one for me. Obviously, he is a rookie this season, but he's been in and around Formula 1. He's driven lots of Formula 1 cars in his time. Obviously, he's won Formula 2, he's won Formula E, but maybe it just shows how much more difficult Formula 1 is to get a grips of, because even though he won those constructor standings and those driver standings in those other categories, he hasn't yet looked comfortable in that AlphaTauri Formula 1 car. He hasn't quite been able to get the performances of Yuki Tsunoda. Like, Yuki Tsunoda's got P11, P11, P10. Nick De Vries much more fluctuating in terms of what he's been able to deliver in that AlphaTauri car. Seems like a little bit of a stopgap driver for me. I feel like The question could be, is Nick De Vries even going to be in Formula One in 3 years' time? Let alone is he the driver to build around for the next 3 seasons? Whereas Yuki Tsunoda, I feel like will be around in Formula One in 3 seasons if he continues what he's shown so far this season. And I think maybe could see himself in a Red Bull seat sometime soon. Alpine, and this is a difficult one to talk about after Australia, isn't it? Although 77% of you went for Pierre Gasly over Esteban Ocon. Looking at the percentages, Gasly's taking it comfortably, and I thought, again, this would be a lot closer. These two, stat-wise, are very similar in terms of their Formula One careers. Obviously, they both have one victory to their name. They've both got very similar point-scoring percentages too, and I feel like in this Alpine car, it's a great driver pairing for them to have, but it's very, very close. And the driver pair is excellent for Alpine if they can work together, is also the argument that everybody's having, of course. Gasly, though, maybe hasn't hit his ceiling yet. Maybe it's because we know exactly what we're going to get from Esteban Ocon. We know he's a very solid midfield driver. Whereas Pierre Gasly, because the AlphaTauri has fluctuated in performance so much, we don't quite know what Pierre Gasly's ceiling is going to be. We did see him in a Red Bull car, but was he really given the opportunity? I don't think so. Red Bull kind of forced him, pressurized him into that Red Bull seat a little bit too early in his career. Like, I'm a massive Gasly fan, but I think that this is a lot closer than these percentages kind of show. And as you can probably tell, I agree with your choice. Pierre Gasly would be the driver that I would go for too, but I think it's going to be very close between these two. And in 2023, I could see either of them coming out on top, but I think it's going to be like 2 points between them at an absolute maximum. As we're up next, and this is the closest driver pair in my opinion, though you guys seem to disagree because you've got 68% of you have gone for Nico Hulkenberg. Kevin Magnussen, stat-wise, is the best Haas driver that they have ever had, has moments like Brazil, has an incredible relationship with the team and Gunther Steiner. Kevin Magnussen has shown last year in particular that he can get performance out of this Haas car and drag it to some performances that it really didn't deserve. But Hulkenberg has come in 3 races in that Haas car, has just absolutely smashed it. Q3 in all 3 weekends, slowly finding race pace. Obviously, you could argue that he maybe should have finished in front of Lando Norris in Australia had it not been for a tiny little error. But that McLaren car is quicker than the Haas car, I think we can argue. And nearly, very nearly overcame that curse and got a podium in Australia. Like, imagine if Nico Hulkenberg would have got a podium in Australia for Haas. The scenes would have been unreal. And it was actually thanks to a Kevin Magnussen mistake that even became a near possibility. Like, Hulkenberg just looks so comfortable in this car already, and he already is just driving incredibly consistently and so well as well. He's just getting so much pace out of that Haas car, and the microscope was on Mick Schumacher last year, the big crashes that caused a lot of damage to that Haas car, but Kevin Magnussen got away with a few little bumps and scrapes over the course of the 2022 season, and because Mick isn't there now anymore, and Kevin Magnussen is now under a little bit more pressure, I would say, because Nico Hulkenberg is doing so well in these first 3 races, those Kevin Magnussen bumps are going to be talked about a little bit more, and maybe Kevin Magnussen does see himself leaving Haas at some point over the next couple of seasons, whereas Nico Hulkenberg looks like the man at this moment in time. Mercedes, the strongest driver pair on the Formula One grid in my opinion. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell are both absolutely sublime Formula One drivers, but you've got George Russell taking over and becoming the team number 1 and the driver to build around for the next 3 seasons. 62% of you have said that. Lewis Hamilton, a lot younger than Fernando Alonso, remember, so we can't really have the age argument, although everybody links Lewis Hamilton to retiring probably even before Fernando Alonso is going to retire, which is really strange, but the 7-time world champion is slowly being replaced, and the George Russell hype is real. He beat out Lewis Hamilton last year in the standings, although I would argue that Lewis Hamilton still had better pace over the course of the season overall. This year, though, George has just come into this team and beat him in qualifying, beat Lewis Hamilton in the races. He has just been absolutely electric in these first 3 races. Obviously, really unlucky, first of all, with the red flag, and then secondly, with that mechanical failure in Australia. That could have been a sublime drive from George Russell and something to really talk about coming into this season. It's hard to say that Hamilton isn't good because he's a 7-time world champion and is clearly one of the best drivers that Formula One has ever seen, possibly the best driver that Formula One has ever seen. Lots of people argue that, but, you know, maybe it is time. Maybe George Russell is just slowly edging him out. We saw Charles Leclerc edge out Sebastian Vettel at Ferrari. Maybe it's now George Russell's time at Mercedes, and maybe Mercedes do need to pivot towards George Russell, but I feel like this is so close. It's going to be really close between these two in the 2023 season. If George Russell can overcome Lewis Hamilton again, then we need to start up talking about like Lewis Hamilton and the future of him in Formula One. Interestingly, Alfa Romeo are the most difficult team to pick a clear number one. If we look at the percentages, Valtteri Bottas, 59% of you, 41% to Joe. So almost a 50-50 between these two drivers at Alfa Romeo. Surely it should be Bottas, right? 10 years in the sport right now, multiple race wins. He isn't actually that old in comparison to a lot of the drivers on the grid, and yet his Alfa Romeo career is just kind of teetering on the edge, right? It started with an absolute bang. He was phenomenal in those first 5-6 races for Alfa Romeo, but since then, obviously, he's been criticised because of the links with Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, and he never was quite at that level. But I thought he would be the obvious, clear number one in a team like Alfa Romeo, especially with Joe coming in. Like, Joe has definitely closed that gap in performance over the last year or so. And in 2023, you could argue he's probably outperforming Valtteri Bottas right now. And after three races, he's definitely matched Valtteri Bottas in terms of pace this season. And now Joe came into Formula One with very little hype, you know. He never won Formula 2. I think his best performance in Formula 2 was a P3 in 2021. And many have said that, you know, he was only brought in because of the money that he was going to bring to the Alfa Romeo team. Well, actually, he's been really, really good. And, you know, we've seen drivers that have come into Formula 1 for money. We've seen Nikita Mazepin and Nicholas Latifi, for goodness sake, over the last few years. Like, Zhou Guanyu is clearly a level above those. Clearly 5 levels above those two drivers. Like, he is really, really consistent, Zhou Guanyu. And I think might actually replace Valtteri Bottas as the number one. I think with Sauber, with Audi coming in, with the future being built around somebody at Alfa Romeo, they're probably going to want to bring in a big name, a bigger name than Valtteri Bottas, and therefore I think Zhou Guanyu might stick around, and Valtteri Bottas might be that driver to lose his position in Formula 1, but, you know, he's got multiple race wins. It's Valtteri Bottas. How am I saying this? But I don't know. Zhou Guanyu for me, I'm a big Zhou fan as well, so maybe I'm a little bit biased there, but he could be an excellent, stable driver to build around Zhou Guanyu whilst they bring in a big name, a Lando Norris, a Lewis Hamilton, a George Russell, to like try and build up the Audi name in Formula 1. But there you have it. There's my take on what you guys voted for in the community tab. Obviously, all of those polls are still available to you. So if you want to try and change a little bit of those, you can head over there and still vote on those. And maybe we'll revisit these a little bit later on down the season. But I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below as well. Who's your clear number one for each constructor in the championship? Whilst you're down there, leave a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. And I'll see you next time.